And welcome to today's webinar, Faster Financing for Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, New Construction, and Rehab Projects, hosted by Arbor. I'm your host for today's webinar, Sam Chandon, the Silverstein Chair at NYU's Schack Institute of Real Estate and founder of Chandon Economics. And I'm delighted to be joined by Kent Newman, bond attorney at Tiber Hudson, Jeff Althouse, Senior Vice President FHA Sales at Arbor Realty Trust, and Scott Chamberlain, VP of Sales, also at Arbor Realty Trust. To kick us off with today's webinar, Jeff, could you just tell us a little bit about Arbor and the low-income housing tax credit business?
Sure, be happy to. Arbor is a leading national direct lender and real estate investment trust that provides debt capital for the multifamily, healthcare, and commercial real estate industries. We have extensive experience in multifamily and residential mortgage origination and servicing, and Arbor has built a reputation for service, quality, and flexibility. Arbor provides a full suite of products: HUD, FHA, Fannie Mae, Freddie, bridge, mezzanine, and preferred equity financing. Lastly, I'd like to let everybody know that Arbor is an industry thought leader and innovator that invested in developing technology to streamline loan originations and processing operations. We also service all of our loans in-house, which is important after the sale.
Great. As a reminder to folks on the call, a couple of things. There's a chat box available to you in today's interface. If you have questions about the material, as we're going through the webinar today, please do type those in, and I'll be keeping an eye on those so that I can bring them to our panelists. Shortly after the webinar, you will be receiving an email with a link to a replay and a download of today's slides. So if you miss a particular point, just keep an eye out for that in a couple of days' time. Kent, could you tell us a little bit about your work at Tiber Hudson?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Kent Newman, bond attorney, Washington, D.C. We have an office in New York, Baltimore, and Charleston as well. We specialize in 4% low-income housing tax credit transactions with bond financings, and we do a ton of deals with FHA in particular. Last year, we did around 134% bond deals around the country. We've been pushing innovation and structuring with Arbor and other lenders in the industry, and we're really excited about this new pilot program.
Thanks very much. In terms of today's content, we've got three sections. State of the affordable housing market. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we see happening with rent trends overall in the United States, some of the affordability challenges that we face. I'm going to move through that material fairly quickly, and then we'll really dig in with Jeff and Kent in talking a little bit about the different programs that are available. So if you take a look at the first slide titled Household Data, what you can see here and what this chart is illustrating is what we see happening with rents in the United States for multifamily housing versus people's incomes. And this is going to be an important metric for us. I think for all of us who are in the multifamily market, we know that over the course of this cycle, we've seen very meaningful growth in rents. We've seen very tight occupancy rates. The inventory that we've introduced in the market has been substantial, but has not had a materially negative impact on occupancy. And so NOI growth has been one of the real highlights of this economic and real estate cycle. That being said, what we know is that wage growth in the United States, particularly for the rental segment of the population or the rental demographic, has been slow to develop momentum. And the way that that's manifested is that really since late 2011, going on about 7.5 years now, we've lived in a world where for a lot of American families, rents have been growing at a faster rate than their incomes. And that's what this chart really demonstrates. When we look at that household budget data over a number of years, how that shows up is a lot of families that have had to substitute out of other really important things, whether it's transportation, healthcare, education, clothing, proximity in their choice of where to live to transportation hubs, because those rents are growing very quickly. You can see that those that differential has come down a little bit, or quite substantially, I should say, over the last year. Part of that does reflect that we have better wage outcomes. Wage growth has improved in the United States as labor markets have continued to tighten, but we still do have that underlying pressure on rents in the United States. And in fact, when we get the second quarter data in a month or month and a half's time, I think what we'll see over there is that the gap has gotten a little bit wider again after several consecutive quarters where it had narrowed. Bottom line, we've had an affordability challenge in the United States facing renters that is particularly challenging at the lower end of the income spectrum. If you take a look at this next slide, what it then shows is, well, what share of household income are families actually spending on their rents? And as you might expect, as you go to relatively larger assets, in part because those larger assets tend to be higher quality assets, that's where we've seen the bulk of the new Class A luxury inventory being introduced. Those have been larger assets that are impacting these numbers. Larger assets are much, much more likely to be amenitized. And so whether it's a parking garage, whether it's a common space, whether it's a pool, those amenities are generally things that we'll observe or more likely to observe the larger the asset gets. And so that becomes a little bit more expensive relative to incomes. Probably the interesting thing that you want to note over here, though, is that there is a bit of a non-linearity here. When you see single-family rentals, low-income families actually spending a little bit more of their incomes. What the data suggests there is that we have a subset of low-income families that are really going the extra mile and overweighting their spending towards towards housing in an effort to get a single-family home. And a lot of the time that's because they have younger kids, and what they're doing there is accessing good quality public schools. That invariably is costing them a larger share of their total resources. If we look at how this plays out in terms of just how tight this market is, what this chart then also demonstrates is that the lower you go on the area median income spectrum, when you're looking at 50% or 30% and below on area median income, the availability of homes or the affordability gap actually gets much, much wider. So the further up we get, the higher the income level. That really is the space then above 100% of area median income, where we've seen almost all of the inventory in the United States come online over this cycle come online. Of course, the newest and most visible inventory being significantly higher than 100% of AMI, but with very, very little that's come online below that threshold, with a lot of what had been below the threshold being strategically repositioned as a higher quality and higher costing asset. That market has gotten very, very tight. We have very serious inventory shortfall issues as we look to more income-constrained households. Another way to take a look at this is to say, well, for that segment or the subset of this inventory that is supported through public programs, what does that look like? And you can see that the largest slice of this on the left-hand side, or the largest piece of it is demonstrated on the left-hand side of this, is the low-income housing tax credit piece. We're talking about roughly 2.5 million units, followed by Section 8, and then public housing. And Jeff, I'm wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit in terms of which segment of this market we're actually going to be focusing on today.
It's interesting, Sam, that the supply that's rolling over in the next 5 years or so is heavily weighted into Section 8. We're going to be focusing mostly on the LIHTC portion of the pie, so roughly about a quarter of the pie, although the Section 8 and the LIHTC very often go hand in hand.
Yeah.
So, but today we'll focus mostly on the LIHTC side.
Yeah, and no matter where you are in the country, the conversation's relevant. If we take a look at the next slide, what we can see is that our webinar is almost at capacity. We do have folks really dialing in from all across the country, but we're covering a broad swath of the United States when thinking about where it is that we're experiencing shortfalls. And we may think of this as being a phenomenon that is focused on the West Coast right now, because some of the pressures in the labor market that are adding to some of the housing affordability challenges. But I think certainly what you can also see here is Texas, Florida, Colorado. Really, for those of us who are based in New York City, we know that there has been a very strong policy response, not one that has necessarily been welcomed by the real estate community, but a very strong policy response in terms of more vigorous approaches to rent regulation that are really trying to address, and as an economist, not necessarily in the most efficacious way, but trying to address very real challenges around the affordability of rental housing in a lot of these markets. And with that in mind, when we look at this from a pricing perspective, what this chart shows is low-income housing tax credit equity pricing for credit. I'm wondering, Jeff, if you could just walk us through this.
Sure, be happy to. As most of you know, the relationship between pricing for tax credits is tied to the overall corporate tax rates. Corporations buy most of the tax credits out there. The higher the tax rate for corporations, typically the higher the tax credit they're able to pay. The lower the tax rate for corporations, the lower that they'll pay. So if you look at this chart, in 2016 we're about $1.05 for tax credit pricing. And then we got into 2016 third quarter or so, and the Trump administration started floating the idea about lowering the corporate tax structure from 35%. Ultimately, that settled down at about 21%, but at the time they didn't realize it. So the market didn't know how far it was going to go. So you can see this downward slope from September through December as the market began pricing that into the equation. And then it settled out about, you can draw your line where you like to, but about 93 cents per credit, so about a 10 to 12% decrease in the pricing for credits, which kind of not directly mirrored, but follows the overall reduction in the corporate tax structure.
Yeah. When we think about pricing from a completely different perspective and look at what people are paying in rent, this data from REIS shows that while on the right-hand side, there's not been overwhelming growth in inventory. Certainly, it's grown, and sort of the scale of the unit inventory chart masks a little bit because it starts at 900 over there. But there's been some meaningful growth in inventory. If you look on the left, look at that asking rent per unit, you can see there very substantial growth in rents relative to the incomes that are rate of income growth that we experience with the target market for this space. Overall, again, I think we've got an affordability challenge in most of our metropolitan areas of the United States. If it's a market that's experiencing meaningful growth, given the nature of the inventory that's come online over the course of this cycle, the shortfalls in inventory, increases in rent. The bottom line here is that when we think about how it is that we might address the challenges that are being faced here, new construction, rehabilitation of existing space, become really, really critical elements of how it is that we address the underlying policy issue that some of us are concerned with. So, with that in mind, we're going to jump right into this question of what our program looks like. Before we do that, just a reminder to everyone who's dialed in today that you do have a chat box where you can enter questions, and as they come in, I'll pass them along to our panelists. As well, in the days following today's webinar, you will get an email that has a replay of today's call, as well as a link to download the slides. But Jeff, walk us through program pilot.
Sure. My primary portion of the program is going to deal exclusively with the new 221 D4 LIHTC pilot, and that's really aimed at the sub-rehab new construction area that Sam was referencing. And basically, the pilot was rolled out in February of this year, and it was HUD's take to basically dramatically reduce the processing time frames that they've experienced, or that many of you on the phone may have experienced under their normal processing under the MAP guidelines, to something shorter that's going to try to compete with the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie. So the pilot is basically split up into two tracks. An expedited track, which is designed to go from 90 days from application through closing. That's dramatically shorter than what HUD's been able to deliver on in the past. The standard processing is a 120-day window from application through the closing process.
Jeff, when they've been able to shorten time frames like that in the streamline, what kinds of things operationally are allowing us to move that much more quickly?
Good question. One of the things that HUD has done in the past is basically done sequential processing rather than basically spoken hub. And what they've really committed to under this new LIHTC pilot is to move much more of the long lead time items, things that have issues, elements of the transactions, front load those that will get them off the critical path, so that by the time the deal comes into HUD with a formal application, it's ready to go, and HUD can, maintain these timeframes that they're shooting for. Now, I will tell you, they are timeframes right now that are goals, and as they've rolled out other pilots in the past, there's a little bit of a learning curve, but as the programs got down the road, the timeframes were generally met. And HUD, the first deal that they have closed, was done in 30 days from review to firm commitment.
Fantastic.
So the slide that's up in front of you right now, this basically gives an example what HUD has been trying to accomplish with the pilot. It's really mission driven on a couple things. It's mission driven, and HUD's really trying to get more into be more of a relevant factor in the space for new construction and sub rehab. So when HUD rolled out the prior pilot that I referenced, which was the 223F pilot in 2012, HUD was only doing about 6% of its loan production in tax credit deals. The pilot came out, and it was designed to be more moderate rehab deals, $40,000 a door or less in rehab. But when that started taking hold, you'll see the production climbed all the way up to 32% for as of 2018. The HUD expects that they'll see some similar increases, not necessarily going up in exponential like this has gone, but really looking at making an inroad, again, for competing with Fannie and Freddie in shorter time frames, which the market, quite frankly, demands. So there are two fundamental imperatives to the new LIHTC pilot in order to achieve the time frames that HUD's looking for. The first is streamlining the HUD application process to align HUD programs with LIHTC programs, and I alluded to some of the processing protocols that will front-end load their review process. The second is the pilot is tailored towards experienced LIHTC development teams whose deals are fully baked, allowing.
What do you mean by that, Jeff? What is fully baked?
So it's deals that are ready to go. HUD, in essence, says, bring us a deal that from the time that we sit down and have a concept meeting with you, which I'll get into in a little bit, but from that concept meeting, we want you to be able to submit the full application to HUD within 60 days. So that means these deals are well down the road. You've got your capital stack set up. You've either got commitments from your or imminently getting commitments from your various capital stack, and also getting your if you've got tax abatement, you've got letter in hand, if you've got a Section 8 contract that needs to be extended, and that type of thing. But generally, these are deals that are ready to go. You know, as a practical matter, the face would be your plans and specs need to be 80% complete by the time the concept meeting has occurred, and really needs to be about 90% by the time you get to the firm application submission, so that these 30-day and 60-day review timeframes I've talked about can be met. So I talked a little bit about this, but let me go into a little bit more depth as to how does HUD further streamline the process. And a big piece of it is HUD relying on us as the lender. They're looking to, rather than getting a deep dive into elements that we've always been responsible for, HUD has stepped back and said, okay, let's limit our review to a certain set of elements. You'll see these on the right-hand side of the page here. For those of you familiar with the HUD world, the 2530 review, which is the previous participation, look at the market study, approve the affirmative fair housing marketing plan, HUD conducting their environmental reviews, and the plans and specs referred to before. HUD's not looking to go after and review the full amount of detail, relying on our lender and our third providers to do that. HUD's really going to limit their review to the ADA and UFAS, American Disabilities Act, and Uniform Standards Accessibility components. Obviously, HUD does their asset management review, and they're going to make sure that the HAP renewals are in place. So the key to all this is that HUD is looking to front-end load, as I said, so they're encouraging elements of the firm application to come in actually early in the process. Some of it can be submitted prior to the concept meeting, and I'll get into this in a second, but some of it can come in after the concept meeting. But the whole idea is that by the time the firm application comes in, the issues and whatnot have been addressed, and HUD can focus on the heavy lifting.
And for listeners who may be new to this, just explain to us what you mean by the concept meeting.
Sure. HUD has, I'll back up and compare it and contrast it. HUD, a concept meeting, for those of you that have experienced with HUD before, any new construction sub-rehab deal would have a concept meeting where it's either a face-to-face or a dial-in meeting with HUD, and where the The market's talked about the, the development team, pro forma income expenses, kind of at a high level as to what the deal is all about, so HUD could get a sense of the deal. That's typically how HUD was doing it on the market rate deals. On the LIHTC pilot side, it's really a deep dive. It's not this superficial, meeting that the other market rate stuff is usually undertaken, but they're really getting into, if you've got a waiver, list out all the waivers. We need to understand what it's going to be. If we've got any long lead time items that need to be surfaced, now's the time to do it. So it is a meeting where the minds come together. HUD introduces all of their internal constituents, whether it's the economist, whether it's could be asset management, environmental is a huge one, and they're taking a deep dive up front. So once that concept meeting is held, then HUD will come back with an invitation letter, which is the key letter to basically submitting the firm application. HUD will invite the transaction to submit a firm application.
As a lender, do you facilitate that?
We do. It's a forced discipline for Arbor, no matter whether it's a LIHTC deal or whether it's the market rate that I was describing. We always have, we like to have a face-to-face. Some of the offices, discourage that. Just a little bit old-fashioned, that sitting around the table and everybody get to see each other and understand what the deal is, I think pays dividends, and it gets a better result in the end. As I mentioned earlier, the pilot program has two tracks. The expedited track, which is a 90-day start to finish, is really a 30-day review of the HUD application, followed by a 60-day targeted closing date. And then on the standard approval track, it's 120 days, which is a 60-day review by HUD, and then followed by a 60-day closing target. HUD will actually, early on in the application process, one of the early kickoff calls after the deal is invited, will set out and target a closing date, which is something that they don't do under the market rate transactions. So everybody's got a view of the horizon and looking to what the target is.
In terms of that concept meeting with HUD, I just want to go back and respond to some of the questions that have come in and follow up to your points. In addition to facilitating your concept meeting, and Scott, maybe you can jump in on this one. The market studies, site analysis. What kinds of things do borrowers, does the lender do to help support HUD in its evaluation?
Right. I mean, when you're coming in with a concept meeting, you're usually having your market study and you've got your plans and specs and your costs and everything, and HUD is willing to look at those things early prior to the firm commitment application actually being submitted, which is a lot different than what they were doing in the past. And that's how you're going to improve the processing time from, their typical 90 days after they get an application down to 30 days. They're trying to pre-look at all of those things. Issues like your 2530, if there's a flag out there, you need to have those resolved. Any environmental issues need to be fully addressed before you come in for the concept meeting, and HUD's willing to talk with you and explain those things and have that discussion prior to that. So it's really a matter of having everything as much as you can prior to the concept meeting, and then having that in-depth conversation with HUD at the time.
Great. Well, Jeff, you could hear a little bit about then what's eligible for the program.
So we go ahead and flip over to the expedited, comparing the expedited with the standard approval. So under the expedited track, it is designed for basically 9% LIHTC new construction deals, 4% and 9% LIHTC sub-rehab deals with project-based Section 8 HAB contracts. I skipped over the 4% LIHTC new construction and went out of order just because originally when HUD came out with the pilot, that was excluded. And then based on feedback that HUD had gotten from the marketplace, they stepped back and said, look, we understand that we're getting, most of these LIHTC deals have a bunch of tax credit equity coming on top. They're conservative deals, and we'll get into some of the loan-to-cost in a minute. But essentially, why not do the 4% LIHTC deals as well? So, comparison to the standard approval process, the eligible deal types on that are 4%, 9% LIHTC sub-rehab projects that are being re-syndicated and without Section 8 rental assistance. So those are the two tracks. Next thing I want to talk talk about is the eligibility that's elements that are common to either track. So whether you're going expedited or whether you're going standard. So in both cases, it's a straight to firm application, one stage processing. The HUD lender must be a HUD approved LIHTC pilot lender. Arbor is. Development team experience, as I talked about previously, is key. Development teams, there are two prerequisites. You have to either have done a HUD mortgage insured loan in the past, and you have to have, development team has to have LIHTC experience. Both components are prerequisites to be in the program. And the reason HUD's doing that is, again, they want deals that are ready. We have this concept meeting, that they're far enough down the road that within 60 days you can submit an application to HUD and then get it closed within the time frames that they're committing to. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but again, what constitutes a well-baked deal? Evidence of the tax credit reservation or final allocation. You've got commitments from the other funding sources, from the capital stack, et cetera. Now let me take a little bit closer look at the expedited track criteria. So under the 9% new LIHTC new construction, essentially it's for new LIHTC allocations and new LIHTC equity investment. The underwriting criteria is going to look at a loan to cost, among other things, but loan to cost of less than 65%, so it's relatively conservative. And 90% of the units must be LIHTC rent restricted at rents that are at least 10% below the market. So those are the key elements. We talked about 4% before. Again, HUD will consider those on a case-by-case basis.
What kinds of things are they considering?
Well, they're looking at deals that obviously don't have, and we'll get to it in a sec, issues with them that are going to preclude the transaction from meeting those timeframes. So that's the whole idea is, and you may look at it as, kind of, baking the recipe in advance type of thing. But that's the whole point, is they want to basically focus on deals that can truly get through the process and screen off stuff that's going to be that you can still do as under the MAP program, but it won't be under the LIHTC pilot. Looking at the 4%, the 9% sub-rehab deals, the loan to cost is a little bit higher at 75% or less. Section 8 contracts, obviously 90% or more of the units, and the project must have a minimum 15-year HAP contract. HUD originally posted that at 20 years, and again, feedback from the marketplace said, is it that big a difference? HUD came back and said, look, we'll go ahead and make that. HUD is going to go ahead and reassess the program as it evolves through the marketplace. So there's some things on here that they will be considering in the future that they may not now.
A couple of clarificatory questions coming in on this. The first, what qualifies as substantial?
Substantial rehab is really a per unit cost. HUD has these formulas for if your repairs are going up above a certain limit. Around the country, it's a little bit above 40,000, but each region is different depending on the formula that you apply to it. So that's really substantial rehab, and if you're above that threshold, that's your 221D4. If you're below it, you're going through a 223F program for HUD purposes, but that's generally the difference is the amount.
Got it. And the variation that we might see regionally or across metropolitan areas, does it fully account for potentially substantial differences in the cost? 40,000 might get you pretty far in some places and not so far in others.
HUD has these limits still apply. I think it's 270% for high cost factors areas, but they're applying the same percentage depending. So some of the very high cost areas, you might bump into that $40,000 number very quickly. Other areas you won't. In the Midwest, you'll see it below 40,000 a unit. So it really does depend on your area, and we can answer those questions, in detail. If somebody, brings in a deal, we can get to that.
We have had a number of questions come in. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, someone from the team will make sure to follow up with you promptly. One other clarificatory question, just keeping in mind there are some folks that may be new to this space. What is a HAP contract?
It's a housing assistance payment contract issued by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So it's a project-based subsidy.
Got it. All right. Jay?
The other thing I was going to add on the expedited approval process is that it's for unit-sized properties that are less than 200 units or less. And the reason for that is, quite frankly, is that is the cutoff at which the region, HUD has 5 different regional offices, and they will have a HUD LIHTC pilot specialist in each of the regions. But the environmental review stays within the region. They don't have to go up to headquarters or go outside of the region. And that usually adds time. So you'll see that as we switch over to the standard approval process, projects that are above 200 units are acceptable under the standard process, and the bulk of that is basically to allow for more time to get through the environmental side of the equation. And you can see, I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but essentially on the 4% and 9% sub-rehab projects that are being re-syndicated that don't have Section 8 rental assistance, the deal must have reached the end of its initial compliance period by the time the concept meeting is held. And some of this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but we can talk about that more offline if anybody's got questions. Loan to cost is less than 75%, and again, 90% of the units restricted for it rents less than 10% or 10% or more below market.
And that's a strict rule.
That is a threshold. If you're close, and HUD at the various functions that and communications we have with HUD, if we're close, they'll consider it. They're not going to make it a pragmatic, binary yes or no. So we'll take them at face value.
Okay. So one of the other questions coming up here, we definitely have some folks that are sort of exploring this, space that may have a substantial experience working in other property types. If I got a commercial building, one case office looks like another case retail. I'm not sure exactly what the configuration of this retail space is, but I'm thinking about repositioning as a multifamily asset. Would that count as new construction or substantial rehab?
Right now HUD is, and I'm getting ahead of good question. I'm a little bit ahead of myself on the slides, but
okay.
As an ineligible, that would be currently it's ineligible. Where it's a repositioning of an adaptive reuse of a non-residential structure. Although I think we had some conversation with HUD recently that they're taking a look at that, and it may not be cast in stone, but don't quote me on that yet.
Yeah, I think HUD is looking at this pilot program as a way to get projects through in a timely way, and a reconfiguration of a readaptive use of a building is getting into a lot of issues that they don't want to address in the pilot program. Yeah. It absolutely can go as a standard 221D4 LIHTC deal. It's just not going to be under this expedited processing time frame. So yes, you can do it, but not under pilot.
Yeah, and reminds me, what is the time frame associated with this pilot? How recently did it launch? Is there a sunset on this after a period of time? They just came out with, the pilot program was announced in February. It's now being processed. Lenders are sending in applications. There's not really a sunset on it that I'm aware of. It's just a matter of them kicking it off. It's kind of the follow-up to their 223F pilot program that happened in 2012. And they've been promising us this D4 pilot program for many years, and now it's been kicked off, and now we're just kind of getting started in that. And we expect a ramp up of business. Prior to this, a lot of developers would not go 221 D4 because of the time frame for processing. So HUD's addressed that by saying we will get a firm commitment out to you in 30 days if you have all of these items submitted with your application. So that's really the big deal here is that quicker time frame in processing the loan to get to a loan closing, because that's critical on a 9% low-income housing tax credit deal. Absolutely critical.
So Sam, I was going to interject, regarding sunsetting. Typically what happens on these pilot programs, they don't go away. It'll essentially become part of the DNA of the HUD program. The pilot was rolled into the MAP guide, and at some point this will continue.
Right, with some refinements, some takeaways, lessons learned, getting incorporated. Now, I know that I asked you earlier to tell us a little bit about the concept meeting. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what happens in terms of identifying issues early?
Well, typically, there will be some interplay. We as a lender will be having some conversation with the HUD office before the concept meeting is scheduled. And there may be emails and whatnot back and forth where we're going to go ahead and tee up elements and issues that we think are germane to getting the deal done. And that should be addressed at the concept meeting to basically, HUD may choose to go ahead and review those elements in advance of the concept meeting and actually approve it. So again, HUD's committed to getting these timeframes squelched down.
Yeah. So we're going to take a look in a moment at some of the financing structures that are available in the market. Before we do that, very briefly, Jeff, to close us out on this section, to remind us again, I know we talked about a repositioning of an asset or a commercial asset for the program being eligible. What other types of projects are ineligible at this point?
Just very quickly, in the essence of time, historic tax credits and new market tax credit deals are ineligible. They're complex deals. We talked about the adaptive reuse, projects involving significant demolition, projects involving gut rehab, and obviously we have to have an experienced development team. And but right now those are the primary ones.
Great, thanks. Ken's going to lead us off in the next section discussing financing structures. Before we do that, just a couple of reminders. In a couple of days, you will get an email with a replay as well as a download link. Thanks to everyone who's asked questions. We've had a whole bunch come in. If we don't get to them on the webinar, someone will follow up with you. And if you're interested in learning more about specific details of the program, there are folks here that will be able to follow up with you to discuss any of the finer points as it relates to your particular project or market. But with that, Ken, let me pass it off to you. Tell us a little bit about what's happening on the financing structure side.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sam. Appreciate that. That was a really good background, guys. So we usually represent underwriters who sell the bonds in these transactions. As folks who may have done tax credit, 4% tax credit deals, no, you do have to use at least some level of bonds in the transaction. The program that's been described here is generally being done on a taxable basis. One of the slides that we start off on is just to show that historically taxable rates in this space are still extremely low. 10-year, I think we just checked, it was at 209 today. So that's still extremely low, as people thought rates were going up a few months ago, and they were trending that way, but now come back down, which is a great opportunity to take advantage of this quicker processing on these types of D4 pilots. The next slide also is something interesting where we're in a relatively flat yield curve environment where it's a great time to borrow long, but with the bond transactions we're working on, you can still invest on the short end that you'll see in a future slide where the net interest cost on the bond piece of this, which is really just on the side almost as a means to an end to get those tax credits, it's really a net zero interest environment for the bond piece of it. So it's a really great chance and opportunity to get this done and try to close quickly. Real quick as well, in terms of the execution and underwriting of the FHA loan, quite a few distinctions from some of the other products. Folks have done other 4% LIHTC deals with financings. This is a taxable execution, number one. That means there's no long-term tax issuer type fees and other bond-related fees that you may see some other products like bank private placements, Fannie, Freddie. The other nice thing about HUD is it's a 40-year term and amortization. So you are seeing some of the other GSE products and even bank products now 40-year amortization, but they're all balloons. So this product lets you lock in long-term debt, which doesn't force you to have to refinance, even if you do have that opportunity in the future. There's no resizing at conversion that you see on some of the other products, and there's no recourse as well. It's also an integrated, as folks were talking about earlier, it's integrated construction and perm financing. You don't have to worry about having a separate construction lender, even though your rehab may be several $100,000 per unit. So it's a nice integrated solution from that.
And I wonder if I could interrupt you for 1 second, Ken. In terms of how Tiber Hudson and your work fits into the bigger picture of getting these deals done, what is your role?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sam. So we specialize, as you can tell, just on the bond piece of these. There's many different parties that are involved. You have the tax credit groups that do this, the lending group like Arbor, and then the bond piece is important. We try to minimize the impact to it, but you do have to work through the local issuers to get the volume cap. You have to add the different approval processes to the timeline. As was mentioned earlier as well, we're now integrating and working with the local HUD offices. They'll actually join some of the bond calls as we get closer down when the commitment's issued to make sure everyone's working from the same page and timeline to make sure all of these different tracks are on the same path to a quick closing. And that's what we really appreciate HUD pushing us through and really taking feedback from all the different capital market components and market.
And Ken, can you address the FHA debt qualifies for the 10-year hold exemption? I think that's important for our FHA.
Great, yeah, that's a great point, Scott. So the other interesting thing here, almost a decade ago, legislation was expanded to allow for substantially federally financed transactions to be exempt from 10-year hold. That's going to be a very nuanced statement for those that haven't done tax credit deals, especially on a preservation or acquisition basis. But in order to get a large part of the benefits of the tax credits that's included in what's called acquisition basis, the project typically needs to be held for at least 10 years from the previous owner. There are some exemptions, though. Section 8 is one obvious one. And then financially, HUD finance projects are also now exempt. So we've been working around the country with developers to actually put HUD debt on the project. Historically, it's been really limited to 223F loans with small rehab needs. Now, with this pilot, there's another opportunity to add those types of financing, those loans on this project, exempt it from the 10-year hold, and get the full acquisition credit.
We've got two more requests for clarification from our listeners. What is MIP, and they want to know what is Davis-Bacon?
Great. I'll pass that on to the lenders on MIP and Davis-Bacon.
Yeah, MIP is these are FHA mortgage insured loans, and with that you pay mortgage insurance premium, and that's an annual premium that we pay to the U.S. government for their insurance that they're placing on these loans. So MIP is that. In this case, for a 221D4 tax exempt deal, it's going to be 25 basis points a year, so 0.25% a year.
Yeah.
Davis-Bacon wages is for any new construction HUD deal, you have to pay, Davis-Bacon wage rates, and I'm not sure I'm going to say that correctly,
yeah.
but go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, it does depend on the location. They sometimes can increase construction costs by up to 25-30% in certain markets. Others, it may already be baked into the cost.
Right. So we get those Davis-Bacon wage rates for the Department of Labor.
Right.
We can find out what they are for a particular area. As Kent said, some are higher than others, and than your areas that don't have a high Davis-Bacon wage rate. So.
Sure. So for the folks who are asking, no, Davis-Bacon is not someone that you have to reach out to. But the folks over here on the call will be able to help you find out what the relevant numbers are. Sorry, Ken.
Oh, yeah, no problem. And there's a lot of slides, by the way. I'll make a note in the bond and structuring presentations. We won't have time to go through all of them, but that's the type of thing we can go over after if someone has specific questions on. So we're going to blow through some of these pretty fast. One important, though, part on the slide that's currently up is to remind folks that if you were able to just go and get these loans taxably and still get the loan from housing tax credits, everyone would be doing it. You wouldn't even need to go through the bond process. But that is part of what's called a 50% test rule. In the tax code, you actually have to use about roughly 50% of your transaction has to be financed with bonds. So you do have to go through that whole process. We do, like I said, a ton of these around the country. We've done it in virtually every state that does affordable housing. There is certain process, timings, people to talk to. That's where we can help and kind of make sure that they're going down the right path here. Real quickly, we're going to run through an animation of how this works. I'm a visual person. There's a lot of moving pieces and parts here, but in order to show this as simply as possible, we're going to have a diagram here that's going to flow through this, and then we'll wrap it up and leave some time for questions. But the bonds are fully sold day one through an underwriter, which is the client we usually represent, and the bondholders are earning tax-exempt interest while the bonds are outstanding. Meanwhile, the borrower is also closing on this FHA loan. It's a separate taxable loan, and they have a mortgage on the property. And the lender here, now this is a 221D4 loan, is going to fund this over time as the funds are needed. The lender will fund a first draw, whatever that happens to be, and that allows the trustee who's holding these bond proceeds to now release a corresponding amount of proceeds to the project to start building it. Now this is new construction, which is, I'm glad it's eligible for the pilot, case-by-case basis. This process continues where the borrower will continue to draw from the FHA loan and the lender until all the bond proceeds are spent. You'll see at all times now, the trustee is still holding the cash to collateralize the bondholder, so they're effectively secured. And the last excess dollar of the permanent loan, which is, again, more of a nuance, but a little bit larger in this example than the bond amount, is sent straight to the borrower to finish the project.
Since you've got the animation of a construction project over here, I just want to jump in with one of the other questions that's been asked for the team. modular construction, where sort of some part of this is happening off-site. Qualify, not qualify?
Actually, HUD does recognize modular construction, and it does save you on the Davis-Bacon side of things.
Right.
So anything that's off-site, with the panels, cubes, whatever it is, they're being off-site, even the trucking to the site is not subject to Davis-Bacon. Only what happens on the site is. So when people figure out that code, but there's a 500-mile radius where that becomes economic, and further than that, it's uneconomic in terms of transportation costs.
Sure, that's right. So the other great thing about the tax rules is, although you do have to use at least a portion of the bonds to finance the project, you only have to keep them outstanding through completion. So once the project's now complete, the rehab has been done, you can now let the trustee know to pay those bondholders off, and that whole bond piece just goes away. As I mentioned, the whole idea is it's just accessing those bonds to get the credits. And that goes away, borrower then repays debt service back over that's the quickest 40-year period you ever see right there. But and it's really that simple. There's a lot of moving pieces, but the reality is that the bond piece is just a means to an end. We're going to pass through a lot of these structures. I want to focus on one other aspect here. Is I mentioned early on that the cost of these transactions are really at an all-time low, and the reason is this is another chart of where the interest rates are on the short end of the curve. Bonds right now are around 1.75% interest rate, 1.74% interest rate. They're trending for tax-exempt short-term bonds around 2 years. The great thing is now at closing, we're typically able to go and invest the proceeds that the trustee is always holding in treasuries that are yielding above 1.74%. And what that means is we're in what's called a positive arbitrage scenario. It means the borrower does not have to pay any interest on these bonds. It's fully being covered by the investments, which is terrific. So they are paying the interest on the FHA loan, which is expected, but the bond piece, now there are certain bond costs. This is another chart to show how that looks, where the bond investment rate is covering more than the bond debt service rate. There are certain costs incurred on these transactions depending on location. That's something, again, we were able to assist with. You can arrange quite a bit for issuers to issue the bonds and all the different legal pieces, including our fee, our client's fee as the underwriter. The great thing is that the negative arbitrage and the interest cost is zero to these deals, so it really reduces those upfront costs as much as possible. We're working on a few other structures and techniques. A lot of these deals include seller notes. We're able to use that in some capacity to help meet these needs for the bond rules. And we're also looking, as was mentioned earlier, we're using more of these types of products, including this new pilot, to allow for transactions to achieve that acquisition basis, which is really needed on some of those preservation deals with larger rehab. With that, I will pass it on.
Thanks very much. Well, we do have a lot of questions that we're going to take a few minutes to work through before we bring today's webinar to a close. The first is coming from a couple of folks that, again, are new to low-income housing tax credit space and working with HUD. How does the lender think about and underwrite the capital stack overall? And I wonder if you give some general guidance on that.
So there are mortgageable costs from a HUD perspective, and there are unmortgageable costs. So a tax credit syndicator may have certain reserves that they're going to impute and require for the transaction over and above what HUD's going to require. So it's really a double underwriting. You basically end up having with three columns. Here's what the HUD loan funds, here's what the tax credit funds, and here's the sum of the two. And it's basically, I'm oversimplifying it, but that's basically it. It's basically making sure all the sources and uses line up. And so folks like Kent and his firm are the eyes, particularly on these bond transactions, because they, at a level of complexity, it's imperative that somebody like Ken be involved in the deal from the beginning.
And Jeff, you raise a good point too. The whole idea here behind the structure is we're taking what needs to be spent with bond proceeds, exchanging it out with lender funds, we call them for HUD purposes, and really just trying to, so you raised the point of just making sure your budget works with all the capital sources. Don't even add your bonds to it initially is what we say, and then you can swap out as needed with tax rules, the bonds with the HUD funds over time.
Agreed.
Are there differences in how the lender is going to underwrite tenant payments versus payments that may come through vouchers?
No, well, I mean, we're going to underwrite the total rent that's going to be received to the owner, both from the tenant and from vouchers. And with vouchers, it's pretty easy. We know what the voucher rent is, and we know what the owner is going to be receiving. So no, we're not going to be getting into the, the tenant portion so much if there's a voucher involved, because tenant's only going to be paying a portion of their income, and then the voucher is making up the rest of it.
A number of questions here where folks are wondering about eligibility of a particular project that they may have in mind. One of them related to the strategic repositioning of commercial assets. In terms of the size and scale of these projects under the pilot, how small can they get? How big can they get?
Well, you get even though there's no minimums. I mean, technically you can go down to five units, but from an economic standpoint, there are some practical minimums. Ken, I don't know if you guys are seeing some stuff less than 40 or 50 units. That's kind of hard to do.
It is. There are some, as you can imagine, there are some fixed costs as part of these transactions, and it's hard for smaller deals to absorb them. Now, one thing we have been able to do is actually, if you happen to have multiple transactions in the same state and you're looking to do tax credit deals on them, we can then roll them up. We call them roll-ups, actually, into one bond issuance, which has really helped get many transactions done that would otherwise not be viable in the 4% space. So that's one option. Again, it may not be perfect to tie in multiple deals at once. Each project, as folks know, usually has to be underwritten separately, but if it's in the same state and the timing is close, it can really help those smaller projects get done.
And really, as far as the maximum number, HUD doesn't have a maximum number of units that can be financed, but in reality, you got to be able to lease them up. You got to be able to fill them in a certain time period. So it depends on the market, how large of a project that market can absorb, especially in the low-income housing tax credit world, where you're talking about a window of people that can qualify to rent in these properties. So it's really limited by the market more than anything.
And there was 200, right? Is the cost for the expedited?
Correct. Yeah. And under the expedited, it's 200 because after 200, it goes into another environmental review, and I didn't want to do that under the pilot program.
Now, speaking of operational issues and having to lease up the building, we've got folks on the call who've got experience in market rate multifamily and maybe thinking about this as an opportunity. Are they going to get their fair share of credit for having experience in asset management on the market rate space? If they're coming into low-income housing.
For this pilot program, HUD is looking for experienced low-income housing tax credit developers and HUD experience. So they're really looking for that. For the normal 221D4 program that's not under the pilot program, HUD will accept that commercial multifamily experience for doing new construction. But under this pilot program that we're talking about today, it's really limited or focused on people who have done HUD and low-income housing tax credit in the past.
Got it. One of the questions over here, Ken, since you highlighted sort of where we are in the interest rate cycle, what that's meant for the ultimate cost of these kinds of programs, how do the dynamics change if we should find ourselves one day in an environment where rates do begin to rise?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. We're actually working on some alternative structures, still using FHA as a loan, where for certain issuers, they won't allow certain types of bond structure to be used, so we have alternatives for that. We used to do these when the interest rate, the yield curve was 300-400 basis points, and that's what really created the short-term structure we designed about a decade ago. That's been still very popular. We think it's going to be around for quite a bit of time, especially with this flat yield curve now, where you can borrow at the very low, long end of the curve and still invest at the short end, which is pretty high. So as rates start changing, we keep an eye on the market, work with lenders in the industry, and work on the bond structures to get these done the most efficiently possible.
Yeah. Well, when we are thinking about new construction, how do land costs fit into this?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer the question. Obviously, there are costs to doing the deal, but from a LIHTC standpoint, you don't get it's not tax credit basis.
Right. So we have started seeing more, and it usually is a related party type situation where you're selling the land. There may be a seller note as part of the capital stack now. It's not uncommon, especially on preservation deals, where they can't pay the full value. They can still sell it, the whole asset, the existing project. The land, of course, is a piece of that valuation, and it's not included in basis, but you can still sell it for the full appraised value, and then the owner, if they're willing to, can take back the payments over time as opposed to a cash payment up front if the deal can't support it.
Got it. Well, I think with that, we are just about at our hour. We're going to wrap it up in a moment. I want to take the time to first thank the team at Arbor for hosting today's webinar. Kent Newman, bond attorney at Tiber Hudson, and then on the Arbor side, Jeff Althouse, SVP of FHA Sales at Arbor Realty Trust, and Scott Chamberlain, VP of Sales, also at Arbor Realty Trust. As a reminder to everyone who dialed in today, in the next few days, you will see an email with a replay link and a link to download today's presentation. We have a lot of questions that we were not able to get to, or that may be very specific. And so there are going to be folks from the team, and the panelists that will reach out to you individually with answers to some of those questions. Lastly, I'll remind you that we're working on our second quarter numbers. Gen Economics works closely with Arbor on a number of research reports where we track the small balance market, the large multifamily market, as well as single-family rental housing in the United States. And you can go to Arbor Chatter, the Arbor blog site, and pull our regular research reports and research briefs over there. And then shortly after the end of the second quarter, keep an eye out for second quarter trend numbers, again, for small balance, large multifamily, and the single-family rental space in the United States. With that, thanks again for joining us for today's webinar. I look forward to chatting with you soon.